May 2nd, 1999, 11:14 p.m. local time. Dragan Petrovic stood in the control room of the Obrenovac thermal power plant, 30 kilometers southwest of Belgrade, watching every dial on his console drop to zero simultaneously. There was no explosion, no shockwave rattling the windows, no fire alarm. Just a soft, electrical crackling from somewhere outside, like rain hitting a hot skillet. And then, nothing at all. The lights died. The hum of turbines wound down to silence. Petrovic reached for the emergency phone. Dead. Across Serbia, the same scene played out at 5 major power stations within 90 seconds of each other. Substations in Niš, Novi Sad, Pristina, all offline. None of them damaged or burning, just off. The entire Yugoslav power grid collapsed like someone had pulled the plug on a country of 10 million people. Traffic signals went black in Belgrade. Hospital backup generators kicked in across the capital. Water treatment plants stopped pumping. Refrigeration failed in warehouses full of food already rationed by 6 weeks of NATO bombing. The technicians at Obrenovac went outside with flashlights. What they found made no sense. Every exposed surface of the switching yard, the transformers, the bus bars, the insulators, the high-voltage lines, all of it draped in something fine and metallic. Gossamer threads of carbon fiber, thinner than human hair, clinging to everything conductive. The stuff looked almost beautiful in the flashlight beams. Delicate, like spider silk spun from graphite. It had fallen from the sky in canisters nobody heard open. If this is the kind of history that keeps you up past midnight, the weapons nobody talks about, the wars fought in ways most people never learn, drop a comment with what brought you here. Hit subscribe and like so the algorithm stops burying this stuff. The material draped across those power lines created thousands of short circuits simultaneously. Each carbon filament acted as a bridge between phases, between lines carrying hundreds of thousands of volts. The arcing would have been spectacular if anyone had been close enough to watch safely. Transformers that took months to manufacture shorted out in seconds. Zero structural damage, no crater to fill, no rubble to clear. Just a nation-sized blackout delivered by something that weighed less than the bombs it replaced. NATO called the weapon the CBU-94. The submunition inside carried the designation BLU-114B. The Pentagon's term for this category of attack, soft kill, belonged in a boardroom, not a battlefield. Serbian civilians had a different vocabulary for sitting in total darkness, while their government pretended the air defense network still functioned. American planners had debated using graphite bombs for weeks before General Wesley Clark authorized their deployment. The concern had never been whether they'd work. The physics checked out years earlier. The concern centered on what happens after you turn off a country's electricity during a war you're trying to win without ground troops. The answer arrived faster than anyone in Brussels expected. Fluorescent tubes buzzed at 60 Hz inside Building 858 at Sandia National Laboratories, Albuquerque, New Mexico. The year, 1982. The air smelled like solder flux and burnt coffee. A team of 4 engineers sat around a metal table covered in paper. Not blueprints, exactly. More like napkin sketches that had grown ambitious. One of them held a spool of carbon fiber filament between his thumb and forefinger, rolling it slowly, watching how it caught the overhead light. The question on the table sounded almost philosophical. How do you attack infrastructure without attacking infrastructure? Conventional bombs destroyed things. That meant reconstruction. Reconstruction meant cost, American cost, because the country that wins a war usually ends up paying to rebuild what it broke. The math never worked in anyone's favor. Drop a 2,000-pound Mark 84 on a power station, and you've created a $30 million repair bill that lands on your own desk 18 months later. The Pentagon understood this problem intimately by the early 80s. Vietnam had taught them plenty about destroying things they'd later wish they hadn't. Sandia's electrical disruption program started with a budget so small it barely registered in the Department of Energy's annual accounting. The concept borrowed from an old problem in power transmission: contamination flashover. Utility companies had dealt with it for decades. salt spray near coastlines, dust storms in the desert. Anything conductive that settled on high-voltage equipment could bridge the gap between phases and trigger cascading short circuits. Nature did this by accident all the time. The Sandia team proposed doing it on purpose. Carbon fiber offered the ideal material, conductive enough to arc across phase lines, light enough to disperse from altitude over a wide area, cheap to manufacture in bulk, and critically, temporary. Rain, wind, manual cleaning could remove the filaments. The target infrastructure survived intact underneath. You could turn a grid off on Tuesday and let the enemy turn it back on by Thursday, only to shut it down again Friday night. One program document, declassified in 2003, describes the concept as electrically degrading rather than kinetically destroying. Sterile language for a cruel idea. A Sandia source involved in early testing put it more plainly in a later interview. We wanted to make their equipment betray them. Every wire and transformer and relay turned into a weapon against its own grid. The engineering challenges consumed most of the 80s. Filament diameter mattered enormously. Too thick and the threads wouldn't disperse properly from a spinning submunition canister. Too thin and they'd break apart in turbulence before reaching the target. The team settled on a diameter roughly equivalent to a human red blood cell, visible only when thousands bunched together. Getting the length right took another 2 years of drop testing at Tonopah Test Range in Nevada, where desert winds played havoc with every dispersal pattern they modeled on computers back in Albuquerque. By 1988, the prototype worked. Canisters dropped from moderate altitude popped open at a predetermined height, releasing spools of filament that unwound into the air like dandelion seeds made of graphite. The first successful grid disruption test knocked out a simulated power junction for 11 hours using 4 canisters weighing a combined 62 pounds. 62 pounds. A single airman could carry the payload that blacked out a switching station. The weapon sat on a shelf for 3 years after that. Nobody had an active conflict that required it, and no theater commander had requested it. The Gulf War changed both of those facts overnight, and the engineers in Building 858 finally got the phone call they'd spent a decade waiting for. Why would you build a weapon designed not to break anything? The phone call from the Gulf in 1991 validated the technology. F-111Fs dropped CBU-94 canisters over Iraqi power infrastructure during the opening hours of Desert Storm, and 85% of Iraq's electrical generating capacity went offline before dawn. The results exceeded projections. But Iraq also revealed the weapon's political limitation. Nobody in Washington cared much about Iraqi public opinion in January of '91. Coalition legitimacy ran through Riyadh and London, not through Baghdad's evening news. Kosovo would be different in every way that mattered. Operation Allied Force launched on March 24, 1999, with a problem baked into its DNA. NATO had 19 member nations, each with a veto over targeting decisions. That meant 19 governments, 19 parliaments, and 19 domestic press corps asking their own version of the same question every morning. Are we killing civilians? The French delegation proved especially difficult. Paris wanted Milosevic punished, but recoiled at anything resembling disproportionate force. The Greeks threatened to fracture the alliance over Orthodox solidarity with Serbia. The Germans, barely a decade past reunification, carried historical baggage about bombing European capitals that made every Bundestag session a minefield. General Clark needed unanimous approval for every escalation in the target set. A single dissenting ally could ground the entire campaign. CNN had bureaus in Belgrade. So did the BBC, Sky News, RAI from Italy. Serbian state television broadcast footage of every bomb crater, every collapsed apartment block, every dead civilian pulled from rubble. Milosevic understood something that caught NATO off guard. He couldn't win the air war, but he could win the narrative. An errant bomb handed him a press conference. A dead grandmother became a recruiting tool for anti-war sentiment in Rome, Athens, Berlin. The Grdelica Gorge incident on April 12th made this concrete. An F-15E struck a passenger train crossing a bridge the pilot had been cleared to hit. 10 civilians died. Footage aired globally within hours. Italy's government nearly collapsed over it. The targeting cell at NATO's Combined Air Operations Center in Vicenza started receiving what pilots bitterly called the lawyers' list, strike packages reviewed not just by military commanders, but by legal advisors from contributing nations who could reject individual aim points. You can't fight an air campaign by committee. But that's exactly what Clark faced. By late April, 6 weeks into the bombing, Milosevic hadn't budged. Serbian forces continued ethnic cleansing operations in Kosovo. Roughly 800,000 Albanian refugees had crossed into Macedonia and Albania. NATO had hit every military target it could reach without unacceptable political risk. Barracks, fuel depots, ammunition storage, command bunkers, bridges, radar sites. The Serbs dispersed what remained. Parking tanks under highway overpasses and mobile SAM launchers in residential neighborhoods. Clark needed to escalate. The target list had to expand into dual-use infrastructure: power, telecommunications, government buildings, state media. Targets that keep a modern state functioning. Surrounded by apartment blocks full of people watching NATO bombs fall on television every night. The conventional approach meant 500-pound laser-guided bombs through transformer halls. Effective, permanent, and guaranteed to produce exactly the imagery Milosevic needed to fracture the coalition. A single GBU-12 through the wrong power station could knock Italy out of the alliance. Clark's own staff estimated that sustained attacks on civilian infrastructure using conventional munitions would cost NATO at least 2 member nations' participation within 72 hours. So, the requirement crystallized with brutal clarity. Turn off Serbia's power grid without giving Milosevic a single burning building to put on camera. Deny electricity to military command networks, air defense radars, government communications, all of which drew from the same civilian grid. Do it in a way that could be reversed, so European allies could tell their parliaments that NATO wasn't punishing the Serbian people permanently. Do it repeatedly, because the Serbs would clean the filaments off and restore power within 12 to 24 hours each time. The BLU-114B met every one of those criteria. No fireball, no rubble, no bodies, just darkness. Temporary, repeatable, deniable as a humanitarian catastrophe. A weapon purpose-built for a war where the enemy's strongest play involved pointing cameras at the wreckage. Clark requested authorization to deploy the graphite bombs on April 27th. The approval process that had strangled conventional escalation for weeks took less than 48 hours. Every single allied nation signed off. Aviano Air Base sat in the foothills of the Italian Dolomites, and on the evening of May 2nd, the tarmac reeked of JP-8 fuel and anxiety. Ground crews had loaded the CBU-94 canisters onto pylons earlier that afternoon, under tarps, not standard procedure, but nothing about this ordnance package qualified as standard. The canisters looked unremarkable, dull green, cylindrical, roughly the dimensions of a large suitcase. A pilot from the 493rd Expeditionary Fighter Squadron later described them as the most boring-looking things on the jet. Captain Eric Schumacher, call signs rarely make sense, don't ask, finished his cigarette on the flight line at 9:42 p.m. local time. His F-16CJ carried 2 CBU-94s under the wings alongside a pair of AIM-120 AMRAAMs for self-defense. The mission briefing had taken 40 minutes. Normally, these ran over an hour. The brevity reflected how simple the delivery profile looked on paper. Fly to the release point. Maintain altitude above the SA-6 engagement envelope. Open the canisters at the designated coordinates. Go home. The hard part belonged to the filaments, not the pilots. Schumacher's flight of 4 F-16s departed Aviano at 10:08 p.m., climbing northeast over the Adriatic. A second package, B-1B, Lancers out of RAF, Fairford in England, carried additional CBU-94s targeted at substations further south. The combined strike aimed at 7 major nodes in the Serbian power grid simultaneously. Timing mattered down to the second. hit one station early, and the grid operators might isolate the remaining nodes before the other canisters arrived. The entire package needed to land within a 2-minute window. 800 miles of dark water passed beneath them. No radio chatter beyond the minimum. Serbian air defenses had proven surprisingly tenacious throughout April. 3 NATO aircraft damaged, 1 F-117 shot down on March 27th in what remains the most embarrassing single event of the campaign. SA-3 Goa batteries ringed Belgrade. Mobile SA-6 gainful launchers moved nightly, and NATO intelligence had lost track of at least 4 of them. The threat environment over central Serbia remained what planners categorized as medium-high, which translated to real English as someone down there can kill you. Schumacher's flight crossed the Serbian border at 10:51 p.m., altitude 23,000 feet, well above the effective ceiling of optically guided anti-aircraft artillery, but inside the engagement envelope of any SA-6 crew paying attention. Electronic warfare support came from EA-6B prowlers orbiting over Bosnia, jamming Serbian radar frequencies in patterns designed to create gaps in coverage. The gaps lasted seconds. Seconds mattered. The release point for Obrenovac sat at coordinates the mission planning cell had computed using satellite imagery updated 14 hours earlier. Schumacher's weapons system officer, he flew single seat, so the jet's computer handled the math. Calculated wind drift, altitude, and canister separation timing automatically. At 11:13 p.m., the system cued release. 2 canisters fell away from the F-16's wings. They dropped for approximately 8 seconds before the fusing mechanism fired, splitting each canister into 40 submunitions that spun outward in a calculated pattern. Each submunition popped open at roughly 3,000 feet above ground level, releasing spools of carbon fiber filament into the night air over the Obrenovac switching yard. The threads caught wind currents and spread across an area the size of several football fields, settling onto every exposed conductor below with the gentleness of falling dust. At 11:14 p.m., Obrenovac went dark. Petrovic's dials hit 0. Across Serbia, 6 other targets experienced identical shutdowns within 90 seconds. The B-1Bs hit their marks south of Belgrade. Niš lost power at 11:15. Novi Sad followed. 70% of Serbia's electrical generating capacity ceased to function in under 2 minutes, delivered by munitions that produced no concussion wave, no visible flash. Nothing louder than a soft metallic whisper settling over equipment that had operated continuously for decades. Schumacher turned his jet southwest toward the Adriatic. His elapsed time over Serbian territory, 11 minutes. Behind him, 10 million people sat in absolute darkness, and not one of them could point to a single thing that looked like it had been bombed. 14 hours. That's how long Pentagon planners estimated Serbian power would stay offline after a graphite strike. The models assumed cleanup would require specialized equipment, protective gear, methodical de-energization of each affected component before anyone could safely touch it. The models assumed wrong. By 3 a.m., less than 4 hours after Obrenovac went dark, Dragan Tomic had already restored partial power to 2 of the switching yard's 5 main bus bars. Tomic ran a maintenance crew of 11 men for Elektroprivreda Serbia, the state power utility, and he'd spent 26 years learning every bolt and bushing in that facility. He didn't wait for instructions from Belgrade. Belgrade had no phones. He grabbed a pressure washer from the maintenance shed, connected it to a diesel-powered pump that didn't need grid electricity to run, and started hosing carbon filaments off insulators, while his men swept transformer housings with ordinary street brooms. Street brooms. The weapon that Sandia spent 6 years perfecting could be defeated by a man with a broom and a garden hose. Tomic's crew worked under flashlights and car headlamps aimed at the equipment. The carbon threads clung to everything: porcelain insulators, aluminum bus bars, steel support structures. Wet filaments conducted even better than dry ones, so the sequencing mattered. Spray a section, let it dry, test for continuity, energize. Get it backward, and you'd arc the equipment worse than the original attack. 2 of Tomic's men received electrical burns on their forearms during the cleanup. Neither stopped working. The smell of ozone hung over the yard like something alive, mixing with diesel exhaust from the pump and the copper tang scent of electrical discharge that anyone who stood near a high-voltage short circuit recognizes immediately. Across Serbia, similar scenes played out at every targeted facility. The Serbs possessed something NATO's planners had badly underestimated: institutional knowledge. Elektroprivreda Serbia employed roughly 31,000 workers, many of them trained during Yugoslavia's industrial peak in the 1970s. These weren't contractors reading manuals. They knew their equipment the way a mechanic knows an engine he's rebuilt 4 times. Niš restored power by 5:30 a.m. Novi Sad took until 7. Belgrade's central grid came back online in stages throughout the morning of May 3rd, with full capacity returning before noon. The NATO Combined Air Operations Center in Vicenza received the satellite confirmation at 12:42 p.m. Thermal signatures indicated active generation at 5 of 7 targeted sites. General Short, commanding the air component, reportedly set the report down on his desk without comment for a full 30 seconds before picking up a phone. The 14-hour estimate had been optimistic by a factor of 2. Reality clocked in closer to 6. This created a problem that rippled all the way back to Washington. The graphite weapon's entire strategic value rested on disruption duration. Keep the lights off long enough and Serbian air defense networks lose their command links. Government communications degrade. Water treatment plants stop pumping. Civilian pressure on Milosevic builds. But 6 hours of darkness barely registered as an inconvenience. People sleep through 6 hours. Government ministries open the next morning with coffee brewing and lights on, and Serbian state television broadcast footage of grinning utility workers holding brooms like trophies. Milosevic's propaganda machine turned the cleanup into a national narrative of resilience. RTS, Radio Television of Serbia, ran segments showing grandmothers sweeping carbon dust off park benches near substations. Children held up blackened rags. The message landed with precision that would have impressed any Madison Avenue firm. NATO's wonder weapon amounts to dirt, and Serbs clean up dirt before breakfast. Clark's staff faced an uncomfortable arithmetic problem. Each CBU-94 cost approximately $240,000. A sortie to deliver them over Serbia ran roughly $1.2 million when you factored in tanker support, electronic warfare escorts, and combat search and rescue standby. Multiply by 7 targets. The May 2nd strike cost NATO somewhere north of $12 million for 6 hours of inconvenience that the enemy turned into a propaganda victory. The Serbs also adapted technically. Maintenance crews began pre-positioning water trucks at major substations. Elektroprivreda distributed cleanup protocols, laminated cards, 1 page, simple enough for any lineman to follow. Some facilities rigged crude protective covers over critical insulators using plastic sheeting and wooden frames. Ugly, improvised, and effective enough to cut restoration time further. A declassified Joint Staff Assessment from late May '99 contains a line that captures the frustration. The author, unnamed, the signature block is redacted, wrote that Serbian grid resilience exceeded all pre-conflict modeling by a significant margin. Significant margin. Staff officer language for, we got this completely wrong. NATO needed to hit harder, hit more often, or accept that the soft bomb alone couldn't break Milosevic's grip on power. The answer, when it came, involved all 3. General Short picked up that phone on the afternoon of May 3rd and ordered a second graphite strike for the following night, then a third, then a 4th. The operational tempo NATO applied to Serbian power infrastructure through May of '99 resembled nothing so much as a man hitting the same nail with a hammer that bent on every swing. Each blow landed, each blow failed to drive it home, and each blow cost more than the last. The second wave hit on May 4th, targeting the same 7 nodes plus 3 additional substations NATO intelligence had identified as backup routing points. 10 targets, 14 CBU, 94 canisters, another $12 million scattered across Serbian transformer yards in threads thinner than human hair. Serbia went dark at 11:08 p.m. Serbia came back online by 4:15 a.m. 5 hours. The crews were faster now. Tomic's men at Obrenovac had the pressure washers running before the last filaments finished settling. By the third strike on May 7th, restoration time at some facilities had dropped below 3 hours. Elektroprivreda had distributed those laminated cleanup cards to every substation in the country. Water trucks idled at switching yards with engines warm, waiting. Some crews had rigged compressed air systems alongside the pressure washers, blow the dry filaments clear before they could bridge conductors, then wash whatever remained. The improvisation showed engineering intuition that no laminated card could teach. These men understood high-voltage equipment at a level that made the Pentagon's degradation models look like undergraduate homework. NATO struck again on May 13th, and May 22nd, and June 2nd. Each wave followed the same pattern: darkness, then light. Darkness lasting a little less each time. Light returning with a defiance that Serbian state media amplified into something approaching national mythology. RTS ran a segment on May 9th showing a utility worker, stocky, mustachioed, cigarette dangling from his lip in a way that looked choreographed but probably wasn't, reconnecting a bus bar with his bare hands while his colleagues cheered. The footage played on a loop. Belgrade's evening news opened with it 3 nights running. The psychological architecture of the weapon had inverted completely. The graphite bomb was designed to demoralize, to remind a population that their government couldn't protect the basic infrastructure of modern life. Instead, every blackout became a collective ritual of resistance. Neighborhoods organized. People brought lanterns to their balconies. Someone in Novi Sad started a tradition of singing from apartment windows during the outages. Folk songs, partisan anthems from the Second World War, the kind of music that makes a whole block of strangers feel like they've known each other for years. The darkness NATO delivered became the raw material for solidarity it never intended to manufacture. Meanwhile, the blackouts still hurt civilians in ways that didn't photograph well for Serbian propaganda either. Hospitals ran on backup generators that consumed diesel Serbia couldn't easily replace under sanctions. Refrigeration failed in warehouses storing insulin, blood products, vaccines. Water treatment plants lost pressure, and boil water advisories went out across cities whose populations had no reliable way to receive them because the communications infrastructure ran on the same grid. Incubators in neonatal wards switched to battery backup. The batteries lasted 8 hours. The doctors counted minutes. None of this appeared on RTS, but it appeared in field reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross. And those reports reached the same European parliaments whose approval NATO needed to continue the campaign. The weapon designed to avoid the appearance of civilian harm was producing civilian harm that accumulated invisibly, not in craters and rubble, but in insulin that spoiled, in premature infants whose incubators flickered, in dialysis patients who missed treatments. The softest bomb in the arsenal carried consequences that only revealed themselves in hospital intake logs weeks later. Anthony Kordsman, writing his assessment at the Center for Strategic and International Studies later that year, delivered the verdict with characteristic bluntness. The graphite attacks, he wrote, represented something close to a failure in air campaign planning, a weapon deployed with more optimism than analysis against an adversary whose adaptive capacity was simply never modeled. The non-lesson, as Kordsman framed it, was that temporary disruption only works if you can sustain it faster than the enemy can repair it. NATO could not. The math never closed. By early June, Clark quietly shifted an emphasis. The graphite strikes continued. They remained politically easier to authorize than conventional bombs. But they became supporting acts rather than headliners. The real escalation came from GBU 31 hard-target penetrators dropping through the roofs of government ministry buildings in downtown Belgrade. Permanent destruction. Exactly what the soft bomb was supposed to make unnecessary. The weapon built to avoid escalation had become the prelude to it. The CBU-94 got its redemption arc on March 19, 2003, and the redemption lasted approximately 72 hours. Opening night of Operation Iraqi Freedom featured the soft bomb in a starring role it hadn't earned since Kosovo. F-16s out of Al-Udeid dropped graphite canisters across Baghdad's power grid within the first wave of strikes, before the shock and awe barrage, before the cruise missiles turned ministry buildings into geometry problems. The sequencing was deliberate. Knock out Iraqi air defense command links by killing their electricity. Keep the grid intact for reconstruction. Apply the lesson Kosovo supposedly taught. Hit early, hit comprehensively, hit before the enemy can organize cleanup crews. And it worked. Baghdad went dark at 5:41 a.m. local time. Basra followed, Mosul, Kirkuk. The Iraqi grid, already degraded by 12 years of sanctions that had starved it of spare parts and competent maintenance, collapsed faster and more completely than Serbia's ever had. No Dragan Tomic waited at Iraqi substations with a pressure washer and 26 years of institutional memory. Saddam's government had systematically purged technical expertise through loyalty tests that valued Ba'ath party membership over engineering credentials. The men who knew the equipment were gone, retired, fled, or dead. Restoration time wasn't 6 hours. It wasn't 14. Iraqi power infrastructure stayed substantially offline for days. Pentagon briefers cited the graphite strikes as a tactical success in the first week's press conferences. Clean, precise, reversible. Everything the weapon was designed to be. Then the United States invaded with 148,000 ground troops, and reversibility became the most obscene joke in the history of precision munitions. By April 9th, the day Saddam's statue came down in Firdos Square, Baghdad's electrical grid had sustained damage from every category of weapon in the American inventory. Cruise missiles had hit generating stations. JDAMs had cratered transmission lines. Armor-piercing rounds from A-10s had shredded transformer housings during close air support missions that weren't targeting infrastructure at all, just shooting at things near it. The graphite filaments still clinging to insulators across the city represented perhaps 2% of the total damage to Iraqi power systems. The careful, recoverable humanitarian disruption the CBU-94 delivered on Night 1 lay buried under the rubble of everything that followed. Cordesman's post-invasion assessment for CSIS noted with something approaching exhaustion that the soft bombs deployment in Iraq illustrated the futility of precision in the absence of strategic coherence. You cannot carefully turn off a country's lights when your next act is to burn the house down. Iraqi power generation wouldn't return to pre-invasion levels for over a decade. American reconstruction spent $18 billion on infrastructure. Baghdad residents averaged 8 hours of electricity per day through 2006. The weapon that was supposed to leave the lights on for reconstruction had been buried under a war that leveled the buildings the lights were for, and the carbon threads it left behind dissolved in rain that nobody was left to wash away. 70%. That's the grid knockdown rate the CBU-94 achieved across both theaters, Kosovo and Iraq, measured at peak disruption. 70% of targeted electrical capacity offline within minutes of weapon release. 0 craters, 0 structural fires, 0 buildings collapsed. By every metric the engineers at Sandia wrote into the original 1982 requirement document, the BLU-114B performed flawlessly. The weapon did exactly what it was designed to do. The wars did not. There's a particular kind of American genius at work in the soft bomb. The same impulse that produced surgical strikes, smart bombs, and the entire lexicon of antiseptic violence that lets a democracy wage war without looking at photographs over breakfast. Build it precise enough, and nobody has to feel bad. Build it reversible enough, and the reconstruction contracts get cheaper. Build it clean enough, and the Allies sign off in 48 hours instead of 6 weeks. The engineering is real. The carbon filaments are real. The 70% knockdown is real. What's not real is the premise underneath all of it, that you can wage war gently, that destruction exists on a dial you can turn to the exact setting marked just enough, and that an enemy will experience your restraint as anything other than a reason to keep fighting. Serbia read the soft bomb as weakness and swept it up with brooms. Iraq never got the chance to read it as anything before the invasion buried it under rubble. In both cases, the weapon's core promise, disruption without destruction, coercion without consequence, evaporated on contact with the single variable no laboratory in Albuquerque could model. What people actually do when you turn their lights off. The CBU-94 remains in the American inventory. Its current status is classified, though procurement documents suggest a next-generation variant entered testing at Eglin Air Force Base sometime around 2012. The carbon filament technology migrated sideways into other programs, some involving electromagnetic pulse effects, others involving delivery systems that don't require manned aircraft. The engineers kept engineering. That's what engineers do. But the operational record tells a story the spec sheets don't. Deployed twice in 2 different wars against 2 very different adversaries, the soft bomb produced the same structural outcome both times. A brief, impressive blackout followed by consequences its designers never intended and its planners never modeled. In Serbia, those consequences were propaganda victories for a dictator. In Iraq, irrelevance beneath a tsunami of conventional destruction. In neither case did temporary grid disruption meaningfully shorten the conflict, alter the strategic calculus, or save the civilian infrastructure it was built to preserve. The final after-action report for the Kosovo graphite strikes was filed with the Joint Staff on September 14, 1999. Classification: Secret NOFORAN. File reference JS-J 3-DOD-9-9-0-4-7-1-3. 42 pages. Distribution limited to 18 addressees, most of them operations planners who would rotate to new billets within the year. The report's executive summary assessed the CBU-94 as tactically effective, operationally limited, and strategically inconclusive. 3 phrases that, read in sequence, form the most expensive shrug in the history of weapons procurement. The report was hand-carried to the Pentagon by a junior action officer whose name appears nowhere in the document. She flew commercial from Vicenza to Dulles, took the Blue Line to the Pentagon City Metro stop, walked the rest. She delivered the report to a clerk in the Joint Staff front office who signed for it, stamped the receipt, and filed it in a vault on the 2nd floor of the D-Ring. Then she walked back to the Metro, caught the next train to the airport, and flew home to Italy to plan the next war.